What am I aiming at? Up here? Okay, gotcha. Okay, I'll get it. All right, good morning. Good morning. Good to see everyone. What a beautiful day. And it's good for us to be together to study God's Word. This morning we are in Ephesians chapter 6. We are almost done with Ephesians, so just a little order. We got 6, 1 through 9. Wednesday night we're going to finish up Ephesians, which obviously one lesson for the remaining portion isn't going to give us enough time to really get into all the details. But next Sunday, Tim Ruffin is going to be leading our class, correct? Okay, so Tim Ruffin will be taking over the class next Sunday, and then the following Wednesday we will get into Colossians. So schedule-wise, that's where we're at. Before we start, let's bow, pray to God. Father, we come to you now. We're so thankful for this time that we can come together, study your word, help us to sharpen each other, help us to see your truths, help us to understand, especially today in the parent and child relationships and master-servant and employer-employee relationships, help us to understand how we are to walk on this earth. We thank you for letters like these that we can read, and we can know your mind, we can know your heart, and we can take those things and apply them to our lives and strive to be disciples of yours. We thank you for this day that we can remember Jesus, and we ask that you be with us throughout the rest of this class and our service this morning. And all these things we ask in Jesus' name, amen. All right, so we're in Ephesians chapter 6, and before we kind of dive right in, let's review just a little bit in Ephesians 4 and 5. So if you'll recall in Ephesians 4, the first few verses, Paul, I think he really kind of underlines the way we are to walk. He talks about walking in a worthy manner, with all humility, with gentleness, with patience, bearing with one another in love, eager to maintain the unity of the Spirit and peace. And then in chapter 5, in verse 1 and 2, be imitators of God as beloved children and walk in love as Christ loved us. And then later in chapter 5, as was covered recently, he talks about in verse 18 being filled with the Spirit. And I think that's really what we're talking about here is how can we as Christians be filled with the Spirit? I've talked in this class a little bit about how in this letter, God doesn't just through Paul tell us what not to do. He actually tells us what to do, what to be filled with. And really there's that picture all throughout this letter of how God wants us to be filled with His Spirit and what that looks like in our lives and how we interact with one another. And as we've seen here, in our relationships with one to another. Now, last class we talked in detail about the wife and the husband relationship. And today we're going to get into the child and the parent relationship. And I don't know why, but there's a bunch of parents here this morning. So we're gonna talk about what Paul has to say here. So let's, and Tim or Roger, anything else y'all want to say that we didn't, just as by way of introduction into this section? Okay. All right, let's read chapter 6, verse 1 through 9, and then we'll kind of dive into the details. Ephesians 6, beginning verse 1. Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Honor your father and mother. This is the first commandment with a promise, that it may go well with you and that you may live long in the land. Fathers, do not provoke your children to anger, but bring them up in the discipline and instruction of the Lord. Bondservants, obey your earthly masters with fear and trembling, with a sincere heart as you would Christ, not by the way of eye service as people pleasers, but as bondservants of Christ, doing the will of God from the heart, rendering service with a good will as to the Lord and not to man, knowing that whatever good anyone does, this he will receive back from the Lord, whether he is a bondservant or is free. Masters, do the same to them and stop your threatening, knowing that he who is both their master and yours is in heaven, and that there is no partiality with him. All right, so we're going to just kind of take these one at a time. And first, let's look at this command to children. So in the first verse, we see, children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. So I kind of see, as I look at that, I see kind of three core principles that he lays out here. First, there's the obedience to the parents. Second, it's that obedience is in the Lord. And then third, for this is right. So I'm going to ask the question, the first, obey your parents. What is this? What would you infer that the parents are doing, given that he says this? Let's start right there. What's the first inference we can make as far as what parents' responsibility is?
Raising you up in the nurturing admonition of the Lord, and take heed.
Okay, they're raising children up, and as they're raising their children, they are doing what? They're instructing. They're commanding their children to do certain things. And I know that sounds rather simple, but we're going to talk here in a minute. We live in an age where, for some parents, that's such a foreign concept to actually command and instruct your kids to do certain things. So by inference, for children to obey their parents have to be teaching them. They have to be instructing them. They have to be commanding them. And I know that sounds probably oversimplistic for this audience, but I think there's some value to thinking about it like that. So when it talks about children obeying, what's kind of captured in this idea of obeying? What's at the root of obeying your parents?
Being in submission.
Being in submission? What else?
Being willing to listen.
Being willing to listen, and then applying and acting on what you're being told to do. To hearken a command, that's kind of getting back to the definition. But for children, obeying is being in subjection to your parents. Now, where is the root of this obedience found, as we see here in the text? Where is obeying our parents rooted or grounded in? In the Lord. And that right there is a theme we're going to see really through these first 9 verses. Everything we're doing as children, as fathers, as bondservants, as masters, it's all unto the Lord. So he says, children, obey your parents in the Lord. So I'm going to flip that. So if obeying your parents is rooted in God and his commands, if we are rejecting or disobeying or rebelling against our parents, what are we also doing? What's the implication there? Yeah, absolutely. So all these things that we do, all these relationships that we have, especially here with children, we're doing these things unto the Lord. And the more I've looked at this, I see these relationships as almost a conduit to our relationship with God. And we can take all these things kind of on the flip side. If we're not doing them, then I would say we are rebelling against God, kind of at the root of it. So, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. So what is that? What's that last little statement there, for this is right? What is that about? Why is he adding that kind of on the tail end of his command to children?
It's a God-ordained
Yes, it's, as Steve said, it's a God-ordained relationship. And children and parents, the way that relationship works, it's something that it's naturally how God made us. It's right because God designed this world in a certain way that there's right and wrong. And when we see children interacting and obeying and being in subjection to their parents, that's natural. I mean, you could turn on the Animal Planet. You could watch animals even understand the parent and child relationship. And so the way that God designed the family and parents and children, there's some very kind of basic natural elements to children's obedience to their parents. So I'm going to ask a question, and probably more for those who have raised kids. What's the most, and I'm asking this because I don't know, but what's the most challenging age for this principle that we're talking about here? Is it, and you can raise your hands, is it Steve?
Before we get into that.
Sure.
We talk a little bit about the fact that this letter was written to the saints, not the children of the saints.
Okay.
That this instruction is for adults.
Okay, that's a good point. Let's talk about that for a minute, because when he addresses children here, who is he talking to? And maybe I should have started there, so thank you for bringing us back to that.
Steve's point, he's talking to Christians, but it also applies to smaller children as they are able to understand.
Yeah, and I look at this, Steve, yes. I mean, he's obviously writing this to these Christians at this church, but the principles apply to really anyone at any age. And I would say that what we see here there's no timer on it. It applies throughout our whole life. Yeah, Tim.
But if you go back to when Christ in the Gospels, he talks about, he condemns the Jews because they weren't honoring their father and mother because they had money or set aside for them, they dedicated to God called the Corban.
Yep.
They were doing the opposite of what it says here, and these are adult Christians, Pharisees, very learned people. They're being condemned for not doing this very thing.
Yeah, and actually, we'll come back to the Corban here in a minute when we talk about honoring. No, it's okay. But there's an element that this always applies, and all of us here are children, but it most certainly also applies to children in our household. Yes, Steve.
So as parents, our role is to teach our children this relationship, because as they grow into adults, if they can't do that, they're going to have a real hard time obeying God.
Yeah, and hang on to that thought too when we get to verse 3 or 4, specifically for fathers. You're absolutely right. So this to me is a universal principle that it will always apply to us. Now I think when we get into verse 2 and 3, I think there's probably a little more application for us who are older and out of the house as we talk about honoring our father and mother. But back to the question I was going to ask, what is the most challenging age for those of you who have raised kids for this principle that we see here? Is it 1 to 5? Teenage? All right, Judy just jumped right to the chase. 1 to 5, teenagers. You could probably even break it down, boys and girls at different ages. There's a lot here. There's a lot we could discuss. I actually would love it if we could have some separate classes on parenting and raising kids and what we do as fathers. But God obviously instructs this because raising children is challenging. And we can go back to the Proverbs, but what's kind of the child's natural inclination when it comes to obedience? Yeah, they want to do what they want to do. And as simple as this is kind of at the root of what a child's responsibility is to their parents. Any other thoughts? Like I said, there's a lot we could discuss here, but any other thoughts or comments or, yes?
There's a saying that when they're little, they can be a headache, and when they're big, they can be a heartache.
Sure.
So there's your answer to the question. You said you didn't know the answer?
Yeah.
The heartache's much worse.
Yeah, I didn't go through all the age ranges. I was going to 19 through 30. Things get a little more difficult and challenging the older, but it's a really good point. It's well taken. Any other thoughts on?
And Doug, it changes, but the relationship is always there. And there's
Okay.
always an obligation on both sides to desire to do what's right or be confronted about when they're doing wrong.
So, good point, Tim, and let's use that to transition into verse 2. So, the relationship does change as we get older, as we potentially marry and are out of the house. The relationship changes, but let's get back to what God is commanding here. So, he's still talking to children, which is all of us, but I think there's a little bit different approach or directive here. He says, honor your father and mother. This is the first commandment with a promise, that it may go well with you and that you may live long in the land. So the first he says to obey, and this now he's saying to honor. So let's just, not to get too nuanced, but in general, what would you say the difference is there in obeying and then honoring? Okay, good. So you can obey without having honor.
Here's the idea, when you talk about walking worthy, you give weight to what you're doing. It's the same
Okay.
kind of thing. There's a special relationship, and you know what they were, and so you hold them in that regard as you deal with it.
Sure. So to honor is to respect, to revere, to care for, to admonish. It even relates to the way we interact with. Whereas obeying in many ways can just be submitting. I'd say honor is related to your integrity, to your character. And as is mentioned here, where is this command actually rooted? Where do we find the genesis of this command? The Ten Commandments. Yeah, so if you want to flip back to Exodus 20. Exodus 20, verse 12. Honor your father and your mother, that your days may be long in the land that the Lord your God is giving you. So it's interesting. We actually just went through the Ten Commandments in the 4th through 6th grade class. One way we look at the commandments is the first 4 are God's relationship man's relationship to God, and then the last are man's relationship to man. And we see kind of the first of those here. I don't know if that's a coincidence or if there's something to be said about the first command between man and man is to honor your father and your mother. And then he also says this is the first commandment with a promise. What is that? Why does it's in parentheses, but what's that talking about? Yeah, that's the promise, is that if you honor your father and mother, it may go well with you and that you may live long in the land. So let's talk about that for a minute. How would you explain that in different words? What is he saying there on a practical level, as far as if you honor your father and mother? I mean, is this just talking about living until you're old, or what's implied in what he's talking about here? That it may go well with you and that you may live long in the land. What does that mean? I guess that's what I'm asking. Okay. Yeah, really good point. And I think Hanish is talking about in Deuteronomy 28, when we see God telling the Israelites the blessings and the cursings. If you do these things, you'll be blessed. If you do these things, you'll be cursed. I think that's exactly the point he's making here. If you honor your father and mother, you're going to have blessing. You're going to prosper. Now, that may look different for everybody, but you're going to have blessings throughout your life because you've honored your parents. Now, let's maybe dive a little deeper into that. Why is that the case? Why would we prosper or be blessed because we've honored our father and mother? What is a very practical way that plays itself out in our parent-child relationships? What's that? Yes, that is absolutely correct. And we see all these things we're doing unto the Lord. And maybe I'm asking such a simple answer that it's so hard. So when we're honoring our parents, we're listening to them. We're taking their advice. We're heeding their warnings about certain things that they've experienced in their lives. And we're taking those things and we're applying them to our lives. As we grow up, we're learning from their mistakes. We're taking their counsel on certain issues or situations that we find ourselves in our life. And if we do that, he's saying you're going to live long in the land. You're going to be blessed. And I think everything we're talking about here, you can go back to the Proverbs and you can see this principle manifested over and over again in many different ways. Tim?
What happens is we take on their core values. We become like them in those
Okay.
things that are right. And that's the picture of what God does with us in the church.
Yes. And I think that's a lot of what this book is about, is how we can be more like our Father. We are children of God. And if we follow the principles, the instructions, the warnings that he's giving us, we can live our lives more like our Father. And so I'd say the principle in a very simplistic way applies with our parents.
Doug, just to reiterate.
Yes.
From the flip side, Moses tells the people in Deuteronomy 6, I'm giving you these commands, you, your sons, and your grandsons. It is the same promise so that you may live long in the land.
Yes.
So we kind of see that other side of that, where the parents have that responsibility of passing on God's knowledge, instruction, wisdom to the kids who are honoring their parents and open to that instruction. That then completes God's picture for how to live that long life in the presence of God effectively.
Yeah, great point. And a great example of where we see that completely messed up is right in the book of Judges. It just flips this on its head and things just go awry quickly. Yes, Steve?
Just to piggyback what Dan was saying, it's interesting that Paul's writing to a huge audience of first-generation Christians.
Yes.
He's setting this up to let them know, look, this is the way it needs to work.
Yes. Now, I want to go down the path that Steve is opening up a little bit more because it's a really good point. So this letter is written to a lot of first-generation Christians. And he's telling those Christians to honor your father and mother. Now, what would be your guess as to how deserving some of those parents of these Christians were of honor? We don't know. But I would tend to think some of these Christians' parents were probably not good people and probably were not honorable. Now, in that context, and whether that's true or not about these Ephesians, that principle applies to us today. If there's a mother or a father or parents that are not deserving respect to their children, what is our responsibility according to this text? You still honor them.
It'd be the same principle as with government.
Yes, yes,
Sometimes our government does not deserve
yes.
our respect and obedience, but we do it anyway.
Yes, absolutely. Don's talking about our relationship to the government. And then we're going to even see this principle with servants and masters. So just because the parents aren't deserving of honor, that doesn't negate our responsibility. And think about it this way. If by chance some of the parents or fathers and mothers of Christians at this church We're not deserving of honor. And these Christians are showing them honor. What is that doing?
It's making them think about their relationship.
Yeah.
Why they're doing it.
Yeah. We talk about a wife, being in subjection to her husband, even if he's not a Christian. Well, her example is showing for him what he needs to be doing and how he should be living his life. So I think in the same way for these Christians, even for us today, when we show honor to our fathers and our mothers and our parents, regardless of if they deserve it or not, we're setting that example of how Christ has redeemed us and what that relationship with God looks like. Yes?
Second Timothy puts people who are disobedient to their parents in with lovers of self, lovers of money, boastful, arrogant, revilers, disobedient parents, ungrateful, and unholy. So it's a sin that none of us would want to be guilty of.
And to your point, Debbie, if you Romans 1:28, gossips, slanderers, haters of God, insolent, haughty, boastful, inventors of evil, disobedient to parents. It's right there in the list of all these other evil things, is this idea of not honoring and not obeying parents. So let me come back to something Tim said a minute ago. In Matthew, and we don't have to turn there, in Matthew 15, there's this situation where Jesus is with Pharisees, and to paraphrase, he's basically saying, you're not honoring your father and mother because you're basically saying, Mom and Dad, I can't take care of you because I've given all my money to the Lord. That's Corban. So, not to go to Matthew 15, but there's a principle there that I think we could apply to what we're talking about here, which is what? What is a way we can honor our father and mother?
We take care of it financially and physically if they need it.
Yeah, absolutely. And that principle, we've got a lot of challenges with health and sickness in this congregation now, and that principle certainly applies. No matter what age they get to, we as children have an obligation to honor our father and our mother, and that it may mean finances, it may mean our time, it can mean a lot of different things, but that responsibility doesn't go away. And I think that kind of gets back to the point we were making. These are kind of universal, lifelong principles that don't really go away with age. That's really good. Proverbs chapter 6. Just read this for y'all. Proverbs 6, I think, in many ways kind of encapsulates this whole section. Proverbs 6:20, my son, keep your father's commandment and forsake not your mother's teaching. Bind them on your heart always, tie them around your neck. When you walk, they will lead you. When you lie down, they will watch over you. When you awake, they will talk with you. So I think there's some really good wisdom there. Okay, anything else through verse 3?
Hey, Doug,
Yes.
I appreciate you going into the flip side of this because it's not always going to be perfect. But I think it also underscores the reliance that we have on each other. Like when you
Okay.
don't have, when you might not have the influence from a parent perspective, or you're trying to learn, certain things.
That's a really good point that Ryan's making, and that is a challenging aspect of this. Not all of us are raised in Christian families. Not all of us have Christian examples that we can look to. Not all of us have godly parents. We all come from different backgrounds. These Jews and Gentiles, they all came from completely different backgrounds. And that being the case, not to mitigate the honor that we still need to show them, that to me emphasizes the importance, going back to Ephesians 4, of our relationship one to another. If you are in a situation where one of your parents is completely ungodly and that relationship is broken, how much more important it is for us to hold each other up, to bear with one another, to love each other, to help. The list goes on. Yes?
Going along with what Ryan said, that's exactly what the young men of God is all about. Some of the boys in that young men of God, they don't have a father.
Yeah.
And the older ones, whether you're in your 70s or whether you're 30s, you're older to them. And that you can look at the younger ones and have a little more
Yes.
for them if they're without a parent.
Yes, and thank you for that reminder. And we really appreciate all that Bob's been doing to host and to kind of lead the charge with that effort. Really, really good thoughts and comments. We're scratching the surface on this section. There's tons here, and that's why I said we could probably have a whole series of classes along these lines. All right, we're just going to skip verse 4. All right, there's a lot here too. And I timed it just right. No, fathers, do not provoke your children to anger, but bring them up in the discipline and instruction of the Lord. So I'm a Christian in Ephesus, and maybe another Christian's told me, hey, Paul wrote this letter, and there's some instruction on, for you as a father, how to raise your kids and what you need to do. And maybe I'm excited and I haven't heard the letter yet, and I hear someone reading it, and I get to this and I read it and I go, that's it? That's it? Don't provoke your children and bring them up in the discipline and instruction of the Lord? Well, certainly that's not all that fathers need to be doing, but just seeing that it's this one simple thing here that he's telling us to do. There's really two things. There's a do not, and there's a fill yourself with this. This is really important stuff that he's talking about here. If Paul's going to say one thing to these fathers, and we'll come back to the mother side of this, if he's going to say this one thing to the fathers, how important is this principle that he's laying out here for fathers? Now, he doesn't say mothers, and I think it's very clear that this is addressed to fathers because just in the preceding verses, he's addressed parents and he's mentioned father and mother, but here he's just saying fathers. Now, does this alleviate the mother's responsibility? Can a mother provoke her child to anger now? No, I don't think any of us would jump to that conclusion.
This has always been very interesting to me. Even
Okay.
going back up to the instructions of husbands and wives, how so much more time is devoted to the husband side of it than the wife. And then here, he addresses the fathers, doesn't say a word to the mothers. And I don't think anything that's in the Bible is an accident.
Correct.
So what that tells me is I'm much more likely to need this than my wife is.
And that's exactly where I was going. So if you didn't hear Don, a father needs to hear this. Are there things here that apply to a mother? Absolutely. But he's not addressing mothers. He's addressing fathers, and we need to hear this. Now, I think there's two reasons I can think of. The first, Don kind of mentioned, in the previous chapter, he's been talking about men and their role in the family and how they lead their wives. And he's been putting way more emphasis on the man versus the woman. And I think when it comes to raising children, we have more responsibility. There's no way around it. Now, I think the second piece of that I see, well, and I'll ask y'all, what might be the second reason that he addresses fathers? And look at the command.
Well, that's actually, I think where you're headed is what I was trying to say.
Okay.
If he's telling me not to rile them up, that means I'm more likely to do it.
Yes. That's exactly where I'm at. I think God knows us. He created us. He knows how we're designed, and he knows men have different buttons that can be pushed by our kids. And he knows that we are probably more prone to provoking our children to anger. Women are, in general, more nurturing and loving and displaying affection than men. Don't read too much into that. I'm just saying there's differences in men and women. And right here he's saying, fathers, do not provoke your children to anger. And then he says, bring them up in the discipline and instruction of the Lord. So let's talk about, we don't have a lot of time, but let's talk about this idea of provoking your children to anger. What is that all about? And let me preface it. Where do we find this idea of someone being provoked to anger in the Bible, in the Old Testament specifically? Does anyone recall? This phrase is used a lot, actually, in the Old Testament.
What about Cain and Abel?
Cain and Abel. Okay, that's good. I wasn't thinking about that, but that's good. God talked a lot about how the Israelites provoked him by doing what? Do you remember what they were doing that provoked his anger? Worshiping idols and things along those lines. Complaining, whining, rebelling. So we see kind of a, God, the Father of Israel, that type of relationship. And they provoked his anger many times. So I guess my point is, this is not a foreign concept for fathers to be provoked to anger, but what actually is it? What does it mean, or to provoke their children to anger? What actually is it to provoke your child to anger? What is that? And there's many answers, obviously, to the question, but
I think, when I think about it, when I was a kid and I got angry, my dad didn't provoke me, I decided I would be provoked.
okay.
I would want to destroy things that he thought were good. I wanted to reject and go against it because I didn't like what it was, or I didn't like the way he said it, or whatever.
Okay.
That to me, it's easy to drive a child to frustration as a father. It's like someone said once, a good example, Michael Jordan teaching him to play basketball is almost impossible because he can do things no one else can do. It's that, we know this is right, therefore do this, rather than taking the time to teach them and instruct them and bring them up.
Okay. So we'll come back to the. No, it's great. Let me preface it. Let me step back again. So remember when we talked in chapter 4 about anger? Be angry and do not sin. Do not let the sun go down in your anger. I made the point there's unrighteous anger or anger that can lead to unrighteousness. There's anger that can lead, that can be used in a good, right way. I would say in a parallel way with children can be angry, and that can be completely off base. They can be angry because they don't want to do something because they're stubborn. Kind of getting back to what Tim was talking about. But there can be anger that is provoked in an unrighteous way through the father's actions. And my question is, what is it that a father is doing that provokes anger in their children? That's really my question. And Tim hinted at it a little bit. What are some things that fathers can do to provoke their children?
Oftentimes it's your attitude towards your children.
Yeah, absolutely. It's our attitude. It's the way we approach them. And I'll be the first to say, I have a lot of work to do in this department. But the way we approach our children, some versions may say stirring them to anger or stirring them up. What's that idea? When you stir up their anger. We talk about people stirring the pot. It's like there's certain things that if you do it or say it in a certain way, it's going to make them mad. Making unreasonable demands. Causing controversy deliberately. Frustrating them. Exasperating them. And folks, we didn't even talk about this. At this time period, and I'm not a Roman historian, but at this time period, from what I've read, fathers, they led their houses like dictators. They were the law. I would tend to think there was not a lot of love in a lot of these families. And so, especially for their situation, there's probably some things that are even more so, but even for us today, I think we all recognize and have seen these type of attitudes manifested with ourselves and even with those we know. Some other examples I put were excessively severe discipline or consequences, unreasonably harsh demands, abuse of authority, being unfair, nagging, humiliating, being insensitive.
Don't you think an inability to listen well? I know people can hear other people, but
Yeah.
they don't listen to them.
Sure, that's a great point.
And I think that happens often with a role
Okay, so
superior person doesn't need to listen.
sure, our ability to listen, and for me, sometimes that's listening to my wife telling me, you're not doing that the right way. But listening is a great example of how we can avoid this idea of provoking our children. And maybe just to go back once again to what we were talking about with Don, the command implies that it's easier to misuse the authority than to properly lead. So I'm so thankful, though, that Paul didn't stop right here and say, fathers, do not provoke your children to anger. Because he then goes on to say, but bring them up in the discipline and instruction of the Lord. So one more thing that, before we get into discipline and instruction, what's the flip side that we tend to maybe see in our society a little bit more? Instead of maybe a father leading in a way that provokes, what's kind of the, flip that coin on its head, what's the other extreme or side of the spectrum that sometimes we see in our society?
Neglect,
Yeah,
not paying any attention.
yeah, neglect, not paying attention, not even having any boundaries, not disciplining at all, letting the kids rule. We've all been in the grocery store and seen what that looks like. But that's the flip side of this. But I am so thankful that Paul, like he's been doing all throughout this book, he says, don't do this, but fill yourself with this. Fathers, fill yourself with bringing them up in the discipline and instruction of the Lord. Now, this idea of bringing up is the idea of nourishing to maturity, to nurture, to feed, to prepare. Someone mentioned, I think Dan mentioned Deuteronomy 6 earlier, and he was referencing a different passage, but to me, Deuteronomy 6 is a great example of what this looks like. If you just want to turn there briefly. Deuteronomy 6, verse 7. Well, verse 6, and these words that I command you today shall be on your heart. You shall teach them diligently to your children, and shall talk of them when you sit in your house, and when you walk by the way, and when you lie down, and when you rise. You shall bind them as a sign on your hand, and they shall be as frontlets between your eyes. You shall write them on the doorposts of your house and on your gates. That verse 7 to me is a great illustration of what this looks like, the cadence of how we discipline and instruct our kids. And keep in mind, this when you read discipline there, it's not so much, I'm going to spank my kid. That's not the idea. It's more discipline in the sense of instruction and training. And then when he says instruction, that's more of admonition, exhortation, or the verbal instructing of. So not to get too nuanced there, but that's kind of what's captured there. So we have to, and this, once again, we have to bring them up in the discipline and instruction of the Lord. What is our society, but what trap can we fall into in thinking is the most important thing for our kids? Okay, good. That wasn't even on my list, but to be happy. Wow. Their happiness is more important than anything else. What are some other things that... Education.
Sports.
They've got to go to a certain school and they've got to get a certain degree.
Or a job.
A job, a career. What else? What are some other things that we place a lot of emphasis on? Being successful. That's a great one. Did someone else have their hand up over here? Sports, yeah. Raising boys, man, sports is... I would love to know the statistic of how many people who play baseball actually make it to the major leagues. It's probably so small you can't even see it. Yeah, you can't measure it. It's ridiculous. But we place so much emphasis on those type of things. Is that second bell? The most important thing for our kids is to know God and to have a relationship with Him. And Paul could have said, he could have had a 10-point list of things to teach your kids, but he He simply says, bring them up in the discipline and instruction of the Lord. You can spend your time on a lot of things, but if you're not doing this, and I'm talking to myself here, if you're not doing this, it doesn't matter. Those things we listed, education, sports, whatever, they're not necessarily bad. We have to, as human beings, we have to do some of those things. But if that's, as fathers especially, if that's our emphasis, if that's where we're spending all our time, and that's usually a good indication of what's important to us, then we can be missing the boat completely. I did a bad job. We didn't get to 5 through 8 and verse 9. But for Wednesday night, we are going to kind of keep moving. We're going to move into putting on the whole armor of God and the conclusion of the letter. Really appreciate your time and your comments. And once again, next Sunday, Tim Ruffin will be leading our class. So thank you.